Good evening, and we will start in about 3 minutes or so. Those who are on live stream will know that. Good evening. Good evening and welcome. It's wonderful to have you here and to have others join us by live stream. My name is Arlen, and I am the director of Common Word, a National Anabaptist bookstore and library jointly operated by CMU and Mennonite Church Canada, where it's possible to buy or borrow or access resources online. It's a privilege to be hosting tonight's conversation with Arthur Boers, author of his new book, an autobiography, a memoir called Shattered, A Son Picks Up the Pieces of His Father's Rage. I invite us to begin by acknowledging that we here in Winnipeg live as treaty people in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Ojibwe nations. We gather in Treaty 1 territory, benefit daily from Treaty 3 water and Treaty 5 hydroelectricity. Others on live stream may be joining us from other sacred lands. And we make this acknowledgement in respect for the host peoples who have and continue to love and care for the land. We're grateful for a growing circle of relationships between Indigenous and settler communities, and hopeful because greater commitments and deeper understandings are being made to foster reconciliation. Arthur Boers is here, dovetailing this conversation with participation at the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies Symposium that begins tomorrow at CMU. We're pleased to share some of this time together with you. I don't know Arthur well, but our paths have crossed over the years while he was pastor at Windsor Mennonite Fellowship in Ontario and later at Bloomingdale Mennonite Church. I was intrigued by his connection with the great spiritualist Henri Nouwen. As a young pastor, I was curious about his status as a Benedictine oblate, and later intrigued by his Anglican priestly title. And of course, I've been a reader of his books, of which Common Word has a dozen different titles. But I'd long lost touch, and so it was serendipitous to recently learn of his newest title, this memoir, and within days receive an email from him about it. I haven't had time to read it fully, but if the inside endorsements are true, it will be a page-turner. This from one reviewer: a poignant, compelling, redemptive cry of the heart. Worlds of heartache and hope. The interplay of Reformed, Mennonite, Catholic, and Anglican voices. The soulful lament of a son grappling with the memories and legacy of trauma. And as another reflects, at the book's center is the question, how do I reconcile all I knew and felt about my father? But this is no memoir of blame. Wonderfully complex, Arthur's desire to transform the jagged, shattered glass of immigrant frustration and alcohol-fueled rage into the smooth beauty of beach glass. We look forward to hearing more this evening about your reflections on your coming of age in a family scarred by violence and your path toward healing through faith. A couple of quick notes before we move forward. For those who are participating online, I invite you to send a chat message with your name and general location if you want, so we have a sense of who's joining us. This conversation is being recorded, will be kept online at Common Word for future viewers. After Arthur's presentation, there will be a time for questions and comments and responses. Online viewers may submit questions via the chat function, and I will monitor those. And after the formal part of the event, the book will be available to purchase in store at Common Word or online at commonword.ca. And I've included a link in the chat about the book. And Arthur will be available at the table to greet you and to sign your copy. We're in for a good conversation. Thank you for sharing from the heart this book and this evening.
Well, good evening, and thanks so much for coming. I'm really glad to be here for all kinds of reasons. I don't make it to Winnipeg very often. The last time I was here was in 2006, so that's quite a stretch, and I was teaching a course over there. I was an AMBS prof at that time, and AMBS and CMU had an arrangement of exchanging profs from time to time. So that's the last time, and this building wasn't here then, I don't believe, if I remember correctly. This has been a new development, so I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad you came. I thank you, and I'm really excited to talk about this book. This is my favorite book, and yes, I say that almost every time, but this time I really mean it. This book is very different than any of the other books that I've written. My books mostly would fall under the category of pastoral theology. I'm explaining something, defending something, counseling, maybe arguing sometimes, and really with an eye to what are important issues for church life and Christian life these days. Thanks so much, Arlen. And a little over 20 years ago, I started noticing that there were certain writers that I especially appreciated, not just for the quality of their insights, but I realized that there was something about their writing that was especially compelling to me. And I discovered that there's a category of writing sometimes called literary nonfiction, creative nonfiction. And I thought, I want to write more like that. I want to write more beautifully. I want to tell a story. And so I started aspiring for that with my book, The Way is Made by Walking. I think I made a step in that direction. And that's a book about a pilgrimage I took in Spain, and it's kind of a memoir. That'd be my first step. And then a few years ago, I did a Master of Fine Arts in Writing, also with the same goal of improving my craft of writing. And I thought it would be interesting to write about my childhood. I'd long wanted to write about my childhood, and there were three things that I thought were intriguing to explore. The first is that I'm the oldest son of Dutch immigrants. So at home, we only spoke Dutch. Dutch was my first language. I didn't learn English until I started playing out in the street. My parents, I was born in the 1950s, an era of conformity, great conformity. So even though my parents were very, very Dutch, they thought they had to give me an English name. And they named me after my grandfather, Ari, but they thought they should give me an English name, so they named me Arthur. But the wrinkle is that the Dutch language doesn't have the TH sound, the th sound. So my parents could never pronounce my name. In fact, my mother still mispronounces my name. My dad's been gone for 30 years, and I still distinctly remember when I was in kindergarten, the kindergarten teacher eventually put her finger in my mouth to get me to put my tongue in the right place You're nodding at me, Ruth. Maybe you've had comparable challenges when you were a teacher. And she put her finger in my mouth to get me to know where to put my tongue to pronounce my name. And it was St. Catharines. I grew up in St. Catharines. A friend of mine from St. David's here, the small town of St. David's, where we eventually moved, is also here. And in St. Catharines, we really lived, we had such a Dutch milieu. So our plumber, our electrician, our baker, they were all Dutch. If we needed a candlestick maker, I'm sure we could have found a Dutch one. They were Dutch and members of our church. We went to the Shell station, which is, of course, a Dutch corporation, and that franchise was owned by a member of church, another Dutchman. And a block from the Shell station was the Dutch Credit Union, where I opened my first bank account, credit union account. And beside that was the Dutch store, where you could get Dutch droppies and also Dutch dry goods, because I don't know if you're aware of this, Canadians just can't make dry goods the way Dutch people can. And beside the Dutch store was a Dutch-owned Mr. Van Dyke electronics store. And so when I was 13 and I wanted my first tape recorder, I went there and bought that from Mr. Van Dyke. And of course, it was a Philips tape recorder. My school was Dutch, my church was Dutch, so it was Dutch. And I grew up thinking that I'm not Dutch. Or no, I grew up thinking I'm not Canadian, I'm Dutch. Kind of this third culture phenomenon, right? And then eventually I started going to Holland and I realized, oh, I'm not Dutch either. But by then I thought, well, that doesn't matter because I'm a member of the kingdom of God. That's all that counts, right? So that's my theology, that works. And then I lived for 2 7-year stretches in the United States, and I concluded, you know what? I am a member of the kingdom of God, but I'm also a Canadian. And so I was quite eager to come back. So I thought that would be worth exploring. And then I also thought it would be worth exploring the fact that I had a vivid faith already as a child. I felt a call to ministry when I was 4 in a church service on Maranatha Church on Scott Street. Maybe some of you know where that is. And I felt a call to ministry. And I had some mystical experiences as a child. And in retrospect, I realized those mystical experiences were really important because not only did they bring me to ministry, they also carried me through some challenging times. And they continue to feed me and inspire me. So I thought that would be interesting to explore. And then I thought I'd like to explore the mystery of my father. My father was a brilliant man. He was a businessman. He invented a North American version of greenhouses. He exported greenhouses around the world. He was a very smart man. He was well-read. He was always worth talking to about politics, whether you agreed with him or not, because he was well-read and insightful. He was also a man who had a terrible temper and struggled with alcohol. More than once, my mother would take all the alcohol bottles in the house and pour them down the laundry tub, and the whole house would fill with fumes. And that's a pretty remarkable thing, because I don't know if you know about Dutch people, but they tend to be thrifty. And to pour all the alcohol down the tub was quite a statement. One morning after his Lions Club meeting the night before in St. David's, we all woke up and the car was all smashed up and he didn't know how it happened. So he had struggles with alcohol, and he also had a terrible temper. So I'll read you today my first memory of him, which was essentially an act of violence. And he broke a lot of things when he was frustrated. He broke an expensive camera. I remember that. I used to work for him in his workshop, and one time in frustration, great frustration, he took a big pipe wrench and smashed the machine to pieces a few feet away from me, and you can imagine I was terrified. And when the handyman came, Mr. Bax, I don't know if you ever knew the Baxes, Cheryl, they lived about 1.5 miles from us, Dutchmen, of course. And when Mr. Bax came to repair the machine, he said, "Oh, did your father lose his temper again?" So my father was notorious for having anger issues. And so I thought that would be something that I needed to explore, I needed to talk about. And for me, writing this book is a lot like doing pottery, really, how I imagine pottery is done, because I don't do pottery. But I imagine, you have a lump of clay and you work on it, and it doesn't do what you want, and you smash it back, and you do it again, and you learn a few things, and you smash it down, and you keep doing it over and over again. And that was the case with this book. I worked on it for 7 or 8 years. There were a number of different iterations to it to figure out how to do it. And the more I wrote, the more I realized the main story that I need to tell is I need to tell a story about my father and my relationship with my father. And this became especially pronounced because a few years ago, as I was doing this exploration, I realized that my father had PTSD, a term we didn't know back then. We certainly didn't know what to do with. My father lived through two wars. He lived through the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, and for the last year of the war, he had to hide in an attic. He had to live in the attic of a house to hide from the Nazis. The Nazis would block off city blocks, and they would search every house, and any male 14 years or older was liable for conscription for slave labor. So he hid there for a year with his cousin. And then after the war, the Japanese who had invaded much of Asia, they left Indonesia, and Indonesia had been a Dutch colony. And when the Japanese left, the Indonesians understandably wanted independence, but the Dutch didn't want them to have independence, so they went to war. And it's a terrible story. It didn't get much coverage at the time, I think partly because the world was war-weary. And I'm ashamed to say, I think it didn't get much coverage because the victims were mostly not white people, so it was not a priority. But 100,000 Indonesians died in that war, and there were a lot of atrocities, and only now is the Netherlands starting to reckon with the things that happened there. And my father had sweat-drenched nightmares for the rest of his life connected to that war. He was fascinated by Vietnam War films because they were a lot like the war in Indonesia. So I realized that my father had PTSD, and I started thinking about that. And then I hit kind of a crisis a few years ago, and I realized I'm depressed again. I've been depressed so often in my life, and I have mood issues, and there's just a number of things that go on in my life. I used to have, until recently, I had a lot of nightmares, and two nightmares. One was a nightmare that I was in the United States, and they wouldn't let me back out of the States back to Canada. And that's true. It's a series of dreams. And the other nightmare is nightmares about bullies, and that's not surprising because I lived with a bully, and I've dealt with bullies a lot in my life. And so I realized that I was in a crisis, and probably writing the book stirred up the crisis, and writing the book also required me to go to therapy more than once. Did EMDR. I don't know if you've ever heard of EMDR, but I did a number of things. And I realized that I needed to write not just about my father's PTSD, but also the effect on me, and how do I come to a place of healing myself? And how do I come to a place of reconciliation with my father and the memory of my father? I loved my father. I love my father. I expect to see him by the Sea of Crystal. That's a Christian Reformed hymn. That was my father's favorite hymn. It's from the book of Revelation, the image of the saints worshiping by the Sea of Glass or the Sea of Crystal. And he looked forward to seeing his relatives, and I expect to see my father there. And I look forward to that. And I was a big support to him when he died. In fact, to the point where the last night of his life, I shared his bed with him. He had a king-size bed. He was in really bad shape. I didn't know he was going to die the next day, but I happened to take care of him that day through the night. I helped him to the washroom, clean him up, and I spoke Dutch to him all night long because I figured that it would be more consoling. And for me, Dutch is the language of consolation. English is my better language now, but I can watch a Dutch commercial of Dutch omas and tantes, and I get teary. I mean, I just love Dutch. I was in the Detroit airport one time, and KLM made an announcement in Dutch, a very boring announcement about what time their next flight was departing for Schiphol in Amsterdam, and I got teary because I love hearing Dutch. But I want to be clear that I love my dad, and my father, he did things that were wrong. He did things that were wrong. But I also try to look at him with compassion. And my father dialed down the violence. So he was violent, but he was not as violent as his father. And I think that he set a course by dialing his violence down. I was able to dial it down even more. So my wife and I never hit our kids, for example. And I feel like my father paved the way for that to a degree. The other thing I want to say, just a commentary about the title. The book is Shattered. Authors don't have final say. Did you know this? Authors don't have final say on titles. And But this title that Erdmann's derived is from the fact that my book is filled with glass and broken glass. My father built greenhouses. In those days, they were all of glass. And we sold a lot of glass to greenhouse farmers. His first act of violence was broken glass. The Boers side of my family comes from a part of Holland known as the Glazen Stad, which means the glass city, because it's miles and miles and miles of greenhouses. If you are in a second story of a house, you can look out and you'll see nothing but glass. So glass is huge. And my other grandfather, who didn't come from the Glazen Stad, he came from Friesland, near where Menno Simons was from, but he did his apprenticeship as a young man in the Glazen Stad, of all places. And while he was working there, there was a greenhouse range where they were growing peaches. The Dutch climate doesn't allow them to grow the kinds of things we might grow outside, so they grow strawberries in greenhouses and grapes in greenhouses and peaches in greenhouses. And a hailstorm swept through and knocked out all the glass. And my grandfather was so hungry because he didn't get much food where he had room and board, he decided to eat peaches. And he ate a lot of peaches, but what he didn't realize was those peaches were needled with glass. And he had intestinal damage for well over 20 years. And it wasn't until after they came to Canada and they saved up their money for a long time for the $1,000 for the doctor, and he had surgery that finally repaired it. But he always had glass. He had huge scars all over his belly. And my father had scars from glass. I have scars from glass because I worked for my dad. And I'm going to read you one story where I broke glass 2 times, so I'll tell you about that. So glass, the glass appears throughout the story, and glass is mixed. Glass can be very strong, but glass can be very fragile. And so I think that's quite a powerful image. It's a mixed image. And I'm 66 now, and I'm not the black and white thinker of my 20s when I first met Rich Boyd over here, and we were idealistic young MVSers in the inner city of Chicago, and I'm still glad I did that, but I don't see the world quite as black and white as I saw it back then. There are a lot of mixed realities. And one of the things that helped write this book was in the middle of writing it, I had a dream about my dad. I'm somebody who likes to pay attention to dreams. And wouldn't you know, we were standing in a greenhouse that got ruined by a hailstorm that came through, which happened periodically. It was always good for my dad's business because he could sell lots of glass and repair greenhouses. But of course, he felt bad for the farmers. And in the dream, we're both standing there in paint-clothed and paint-stained and putty-stained clothes. And I grabbed an empty putty bucket, a five-gallon bucket, and I started to pick up the broken glass. That's the first job I ever did for my dad. I went to a construction site when I was 11 years old, and I picked up broken glass, and I started to clean it up. And my dad said, "That's okay, son. You don't have to do that anymore." And I was really moved by that dream, and I took 2 messages for it. The first was, yeah, it's time, my dad's releasing me, and it's time, and I can do this work that I need to do. So that was good. And the other thing, when I woke up, that's where I realized glass is throughout my life. And so then I wanted to write a story. I wanted to write my life story, but include images of glass and experiences with glass. So that's where the book came from, and the image is kintsugi. I don't know if any of you know about kintsugi. It's a Japanese art form where if a precious piece of ceramic breaks, the Japanese might mend it with a precious metal, such as gold. And there's a new beauty that emerges that doesn't hide the cracks, but actually shows the cracks. And I think that's a great image for the story of my life. So my plan is I'd like to read 2 short chapters. I assure you they're short. They're about 12 minutes each. And in Anglican language, that means they're each the extent of about the length of a homily. If it goes longer than 12 minutes, we get in trouble in the Anglican Church. So I'll read 2 stories, and one will be from near the beginning of the book that will set the suspense, and the second will be from the end of the book so you know that there's some resolution. But I'm not going to read in between, and I have a scheme here. I'm hoping that if you hear the beginning that gives you suspense, and you hear the end that shows some hope, you'll go, I wonder how he got from there to there. Then you'll read it. That's my scheme. And then afterwards, Afterwards, we can have time for a little conversation. How's that sound? Chapter 1. "Ow, you're hurting me," are among the first words I remember, an oft-repeated, all too familiar refrain. The complaint crept through the thin wall between their bedroom and mine, startled pain suddenly sparking from her tone, then clanging in my ears. I did not stay in bed or wish the sound away. I did not cover my head with my pillow to drown it out. I did not close my eyes hoping to sleep. Instead, I felt called. I had a duty. I rose on the wobbly mattress, flannel giraffe pajamas damp from sweaty sleep, my hair mussed. I clambered over my crib rail, pivoted my torso across, and dropped to the hardwood. I ran out my door and into theirs, arms stretched high, crying, "Superman!" And bounding over the floor, I leaped onto the double bed that almost filled their small bedroom, crawling over bunched sheets and prickly Dutch woolen blankets, squirming between my mom and dad. I pried apart their grappling. I felt no danger to myself, but I wanted my mother safe. They laughed at 3-year-old me. I don't laugh now. He manhandled her, poked her ribs and belly, twisted arms, tested limits. My rush to intervene became a routine. And years passed before I realized their collusion. Sometimes they made early morning noise just to enjoy the pajama-clad toddler's rescue efforts. A great way to start the day. Another hilarious family story. They meant no harm. They were just playing. Unable to distinguish protest from pretense, I joined their drama. Yet she did not always pretend. This was not always a game. On occasion, her tone rang pain-tinged, her voice rising, "Ow, you're hurting me." Words twisted in excruciation. And failing to sort out aches from acting, I always reacted, certain I did the right thing. Rescuers, shining armor knights, steed-mounted cowboys, my namesake, King Arthur, deliver distressed damsels. Victims suffer a villain's dastardly deeds, and Dudley Do-Right sets things straight. TV, Tarzan, Robin Hood, the Lone Ranger taught me scripts that I enacted over and again from my bedroom to theirs. My father regularly went off course, drinking too much, smashing a car and forgetting how it happened, exploding with expletives. My mother would recruit another man in the family, her father or his uncle, to talk to Plone. And Papa would straighten out for a time, but the reform never lasted. Eventually, I would be tapped to intervene. No doubt that contributed to my formation later as a pastor, perpetually looking out to rescue others. In our small apartment on Martindale Road, I admired the Indonesian batik draped on the living room wall. Eventually, I would learn that my father brought that back from his military service, a time measured in months that burdened him with 40-plus years of sweat-drenched nightmares. Below the colorful fabric squatted a gray couch. Kitty corner from the sofa was a matching chair. I ran toy cars along the upholstery, creating curving roads from the warp and weft, soft mountains out of armrests and cushions. Resting atop a shelf, a light brown starfish, knobbly and dried, leaned against the wall. For years, I would assume it came from nearby Lake Ontario, where we occasionally went to the beach. A geranium in a clay pot given by a local greenhouse farmer sat on our pine coffee table, as did a stubby brown bottle of old Vienna, beer sweating beside it. A multicolored glass bowl was also on the table, often filled with Macintoshes. That bowl always on display wherever we lived, until that wedding gift and I were shattered on the same day 12 years later. A wide ashtray collected my father's Buckingham butts, and a cigarette package with royal-looking gold and scarlet coat of arms perched on the edge. greenery sprouted on windowsills. The potted geranium, leaves and flowers trembling, hurtled toward the picture window, moist dirt drifting down, sprinkling onto the carpet. I watched without surprise. I already knew that such things happened in our house. My mother ducked. The pot passed her and struck the pane. The bump, at first hardly audible. The surface gave slightly, shimmering and reverberating, a softly tinkling cymbal, then spidered suddenly in all directions. Chiming splinters hailed down. Large shards wobbled and dropped. Some impaled the floor inside, others the lawn 2 floors down outside. Others shattered as they fell to wood and earth, and the plant continued its angry al fresco arc before abruptly plummeting from sight. Once objects stopped moving and the pane ceased integrating, when no more glass fell, I heard robins in trees and cars passing a block away. Cool air hinting of spring thaw seeped around, scents I encountered often over the following years in many greenhouse visits. I was there. Only 3. What could I understand? Glass breaks. I learned that early, but no one told me that smashing windows is outlandish, a troubling, dangerous infraction of civility, family life, simple good sense, thrift, safety. I remember nothing about their argument, points scored, insults lodged. Picturing this now, I like to see my parents as I knew them later, middle-aged or older, and certainly ought to know better. But doing the math, I realized that she was 27 and he 33, both of them younger than my adult children. I could be the father of my troubled, immature parents. At half my present age, my parents had already endured more trauma, danger, and loss than I will ever know. They witnessed lives taken by Nazis and feared their own apprehension, suffered the deprivations of economic collapse, weathered their own parents' violence, and gave up almost everything when they came to Canada from the Netherlands. They were only allowed to bring 1 crate of belongings per family and $50 per person to this foreign country, where they could not speak the language and were insulted as displaced persons and told more than once, "Go back to where you came from." My parents knew about trying to survive, not the luxury of dwelling on feelings, whether their own or others. Over the years, my family talked about this incident with the pot of geraniums, and Papa never showed embarrassment or remorse about this or any other tantrum. Men did not have to explain, let alone apologize. In each recounting of the window breaking, both parents again and again agreed on the most amusing aspect. As that plant hurtled past my mother, I taunted, inspired no doubt by the Three Stooges, a show my father and I enjoyed together. "Nya, you missed her." In some tellings, I stuck out my tongue and blew a raspberry. Whenever the memory of the shattered window came up, they always laughed and concluded with my wise crack. After his outbursts, my father left others, my mother, employees, eventually my sister and me, to pick up literal and figurative pieces. Hurled objects were never his responsibility. Other people or circumstances were to blame for his rage. Someone else could make amends, as my mother often did. And this time, too, safety demanded that she clean up right away, carefully sweeping with dustpan and broom, and then vacuuming finer fragments. She warned us to avoid the area near the window, especially in socks or bare feet. For months afterward, she found errant, unexpected slivers stuck in carpet fibers, randomly sparkling in the sunlight. And reputation required that she get out to the yard soon, retrieving sharp shards and not to mention the smashed pot and broken plant, quickly, so the neighbors did not see, did not know, did not figure out that Plune lost his temper again. I could not yet articulate what I was beginning to learn. Men explode dangerously. No one is safe around my dad. Be wary. Wiser to stay on the far side of the room. Sometimes it might be me on the receiving end, and with practice, he would not miss. I have always noticed glass, paid attention to it. One relative ate it, although not on purpose, badly damaging his intestines. My father used it in his work, repairing and building greenhouses. He bought it wholesale to sell to greenhouse farmers. And when angry, he flung panes and smashed them. At home, we stored and sold it. As a teenager, I unloaded, moved, and stacked bulky 75-pound wooden crates, kists in Dutch, filled with glass panes, from manufacturers' transport trucks into our storage, or into customers' vans, or onto our pickups for delivery to construction sites. Kist is Dutch for crate, chest, or box. It can also mean coffin or casket. The cheap wood put splinters in my palms and blisters on my fingers. The work taxed my muscles and had to be done carefully. Unwieldy cases bore the label fragile contents, and I wore steel boots to prevent my toes getting crushed. All that expletive-deleted glass. As an Anglican priest, I intone at funerals, earth to earth, ashes to ashes. George Herbert, another Anglican priest, in a poem wrote that flesh is but the glass which holds the dust. Glass is made from sand, a form of earth, and combined with ashes. Sometimes it even forms naturally when lightning strikes beaches. Perhaps observing that long ago gave people the idea. Glass manufacturing goes back more than 5,000 years. Ancient Romans already had glass windows. Glass is central to our lives. Windshields and windows, telescopes and test tubes, binoculars and bulbs and barometers, microscopes and mirrors and magnifiers, lights and lenses, preserving jars and prisms, jewelry, vases, stained glass, chandeliers, crystal goblets. Glass improves vision for the short and farsighted. And with my first pair of glasses at age 10, green blotches above my head and below my feet resolved into discrete tree leaves and distinct grass blades, thousands and 10,000s of them, and I had no idea until then. And glass sparks our imagination. Cinderella's slipper, Sleeping Beauty's kist, warnings against living in or throwing stones in glass houses. We read The Glass Castle, The Glass Menagerie, The Glass Key, and of course, Through the Looking Glass. From TV, I knew about glass eyes, often a villain's disfigurement, and in fights one hoped for the happy prospect of an enemy's glass chin. When I was a young adult, the band Blondie introduced a heart of glass. And the Apostle Paul writes that now we see through a glass darkly. In our Arthurian legends, my namesake King Arthur disappeared into Avalon, the Isle of Glass, and Merlin was trapped in a glass house or glass cavern. Glass can connote peril. The sociological theory, broken windows, suggests that shattered panes adversely affect urban crime rates. And as a teen, I read of November 1938, when Nazis attacked Jewish businesses, storefronts, homes, synagogues, an event called Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, because of smashed panes littering streets and sidewalks. On my far smaller scale, fractured glass felt personal, and I learned wary attention. Now the second last chapter. In my mid-30s, 2 decades after the last time my father beat me and 2 years after he died, I broke glass twice in 1 week. Once for the first time in my life in anger. On a September Saturday atop a stepladder, I was scraping the peeling wood around our garage window, preparing it for painting later that month. I thought about long to-do lists at home with our small children and at the rural church that I pastored, Bloomingdale, which was suddenly attracting newcomers who squeezed our small space, not to mention our comfort zone. In a couple of hours, I was to head to a Christian education conference where I would give a workshop on spirituality. Plus, this window needed work. And on top of it all, I was to leave in 48 hours for a 5-day retreat. Overwhelmed by an impossibly long list of duties that was complicated by my upcoming trip, a cloud of steamy mist descended into my brain and swirled behind my eyes. I grunted in frustration and plunged my fist against the window, startled by how little resistance the glass offered, how easily it fractured like the thinnest ice I could have pushed my hand through with no effort necessary. The cascade of jagged accusers clattered to the ground, and I felt relief that I had not cut myself, as such an injury would be a little hard to explain, especially to congregants. I fetched a broom and a dustpan from the kitchen. As I stepped back into the garage, my mother pulled up. She had just completed the 90-minute drive for a prearranged weekend visit. She saw the broken window and scattered glass. I averted my face from her. "Is it we're so?" she asked. "Is it happening again?" She remembered my father. With nothing to say, I finished cleaning up the debris, then went in, showered, changed into good clothes, put on a tie. I drove to the conference held in a local high school gym where Sunday school teachers listened carefully to me as I claimed that prayer can de-stress our lives. And the irony was not lost on me. On the way home, I stopped at a hardware store and spent the day's honorarium on a replacement pane that the proprietor cut to size, along with a can of gray putty, glazing nails, and a putty knife. And back home, placing and securing that window, I remembered that my father glazed for years, but never once repaired his own rage-inflicted destruction. On Monday, I went to stay with Henry Nouwen, a priest whose books had influenced my prayer life and ministry. He resided an hour's drive away from Waterloo, just an hour north of Toronto, at Daybreak, part of L'Arche, a worldwide network of communities where people with developmental and intellectual challenges live with their assistance. I had interviewed Nouwen a few times for magazines and then visited him a couple times. And now he would guide me on a 5-day retreat. He told me that duration was quite short. Yet it was the longest retreat I had ever taken, and I could not imagine a longer one given all my home and church responsibilities. I knew that Henry was speaking at a nearby seminary that day, so as expected, when I arrived at his house, no one was there, and I let myself in. I found my room where I was welcomed by a warm note and vase of bright sunflowers that testified to Henry's love for Van Gogh. Minutes later, he phoned, apologizing for not being there for my arrival, and I was glad to hear his familiar and comforting Dutch accent, the one that consoles and reassures me. He said he'd given me the best room. That first evening, through my open door, he saw me reading, and he said, "You better get a nice lamp. This one is so awful." And he went down the hall, and in minutes showed up with one that he'd retrieved from his bedroom. A while later, he returned, handing me a CD player and discs, Bach's Brandenburg Concertos, Beethoven's Midnight Sonata, Mozart's Symphonies, Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and he told me, "Play these as loud as you like, I won't mind." Every day we met twice for an hour to discuss scripture passages that he'd assigned for my meditation, insisting that I use his personal copy of the Jerusalem Bible. And pondering those texts, my week's mantra slowly emerged from Mary's Magnificat: "The Almighty has done great things for me." We ate breakfast together every morning, and later in the day drank tea that he prepared. Once we went to a cozy Austrian restaurant nearby. The proprietors knew him well. Our meal, tender red cabbage, simmered in apples, nutmeg, and cloves, sour braten with sweetly tangy gravy, followed by strong coffee with real whipping cream, reminded us of Dutch cooking. On my second day, we went to his office at the front of the Daybreak property. He showed me shelves of his published books. Just take whichever ones you want, he told me. And then he gave me 3 copies of the Dutch translation of his prodigal son book, Eindelijk Thuis, which means finally home, the title naming a yearning that he and I both long shared. Another evening, he arrived back at the house around 10 p.m. I was in a chair illuminated by his lamp, reading with my feet propped on the bed. He sat down on the mattress and he gave my legs a friendly pat, and we reviewed our day together for each other. Henry explained that he'd made sure his calendar that week had plenty of space for our conversations. And I knew this was no small thing, given his responsibilities and long to-do lists. Why, I asked, when he had many other commitments. And he told me, we've built up a relationship and know each other, and you have the stamina to do your thing without being intrusive or demanding. I thought about that, saying nothing, and then he added, by the way, I don't want you to pay anything to Daybreak for this stay. You are here as my friend. All week I struggled with whether to tell him about that window. It felt ridiculous and humiliating. Plus, every time I came to Daybreak, I seemed to be in a crisis. During my first visit, an hour-long interview turned into a day-long conversation, and Henry addressed my evident stress at that time. Toward the end of our time together, he pulled a chair near and leaned toward me, explaining, you have a tender heart. This means that God is calling you to a deep spiritual life. Tenderness can destroy you because you can just be pulled apart, burn out, and the whole thing. But you can also be a mystic, and that's what you obviously have to be. Well, what does that mean? I asked. And he said, to be a mystic, I don't mean anything more than that God is the one who loves you deeply. And that's what you have to trust. And keep trusting, keep trusting, keep trusting. On this visit, I evasively summarized my recent days of feeling once again overloaded and stressed, and I couldn't bear to confess the broken glass, even when he said at one point, our time together will be helpful only if you are completely honest. Each morning we prayed with a Carmelite breviary. I kept losing my place in it, and Henry helped me find my way. After the formal prayers, we sat for 30 minutes of silence, and he concluded our time by kneeling and stretching out his hands and reciting aloud from memory Charles de Foucault's prayer. Father, I abandon myself into your hands. Do with me what you will. Whatever you may do, I thank you. I am ready for all. I accept all. Let only your will be done in me and in all your creatures. I wish no more than this, O Lord. Into your hands I commend my soul. I offer it to you with all the love of my heart, for I love you, Lord, and so need to give myself, to surrender myself into your hands without reserve and with boundless confidence, for you are my Father. Amen. After morning prayers, we breakfasted on buttered rye toast and thin Gouda slices. I had brought him a Dutch cheese plain as a gift, and Henry boiled milk for our coffee. We chatted, aware that within the hour, large community assistants and members would arrive for Mass in the chapel downstairs. At one breakfast, Henry told me that I needed to make my ministry more Eucharistic, he said. But I had no idea what that meant. Our church celebrated the supper only a few times a year, but this time I didn't dare ask for clarification. I felt like I should know. Later that day, he gave me a manuscript of a forthcoming book, With Burning Hearts, a meditation on the Eucharistic life. And that's where I learned that in the Eucharist, Jesus takes us, Jesus blesses us, Jesus breaks us, and then Jesus gives us into ministry. At the end of Thursday's breakfast, Henry stood up and said, "I need to make a quick phone call." He, by the way, was always in a hurry. He always had to do things quick. He once bought a new car, and he drove so fast from the car lot, the 2 miles to Daybreak, that he totaled the car before he got home. And anyway, I could tell you all kinds of stories about how he lived in contradiction to, the solitude and the patience and the silence. But then, we're all contradictions, aren't we? So I need to make a quick phone call, he paused, he said, and then he paused and said, "Oh, can you clean these for me?" He gestured toward 2 simple glass candle holders on the counter, streaked by discolored wax that had dripped and accumulated along the sides. "Sure, ik moet iets doen voor de kost. I have to do something for room and board." And one at a time, I held each holder over the garbage bin. With a butter knife, I pried and scraped away large wax chunks, and then I removed remaining bits with my thumbnail. Finally, I filled the dishpan with warm water and immersed the first, scrubbing and setting it aside on a kitchen towel before doing the same for the second. Drying them, I was shocked to see cracks in one of them. But how? I thought I had handled them carefully, set them down gently. Had the fracture been there before and I overlooked it? Surely I would have noticed. Is this how I repay Henry's hospitality? What would he say? I knew that he cherished nice things. Cheryl, a community assistant, wandered through the kitchen. "Look," I told her, "somehow this candle holder cracked. I don't know whether I did it, but I feel bad. On the other hand, they're pretty simple. They can't be worth much." "Unfortunately," Cheryl said, "they are. A famous glass blower in Vermont custom made them just for Henry." My stomach tightened over the mishap. I worried about his disapproval, or worse, I could hardly sit still as I waited. Minutes later, he burst into the kitchen, hurrying to get to the basement. "Wait, Henry, I have to show you something," I said. "Okay, but I don't have much time. I must get ready. The service is in a few minutes." "Henry, I'm not sure what happened, whether I did it or not, but one holder is cracked. I thought I was careful." Henry grew very still, suddenly no longer in a rush. He looked toward the counter and turned the glass in his hands, studying the damage. I waited, fretting about his reaction. Would he scold me and tell me about its value, its specialness, its uniqueness? Would he question whether I was careful enough? Would he lament the loss of something precious and valuable? Would he raise his voice? Would this ruin even end my visit, perhaps all future visits? Would he ask, as my father often did, "What's wrong with you?" "Oh, Arthur," Henry said, for his accent, like my father's, always mispronounced my name. "It's okay. Don't worry." And then he pulled me from my kitchen chair and he wrapped his long arms around me, sweeping me into a bear hug, clinging tightly to me. I felt like I could feel every one of his 10 long fingers poking into my back. And then he let me go, and he disappeared, and he hustled down the stairway steps noisily to the chapel, and it all went so fast that I hardly knew what had happened. I went to brush my teeth, hoping to calm myself, and then I too hustled down those stairway planks. I settled into the gentle sway of an IKEA armchair, one where I had meditated on scripture text every morning and afternoon that week. Assistants and members arrived, unwrapping blankets, positioning wheelchairs, murmuring encouragements, arranging large pillows for contorted bodies, massaging backs and shoulders. I knew what to expect: informal Eucharistic liturgy and simple songs that involved and included people with severe handicaps, some of them periodically moaning. I would savor Taizé chants and the upcoming Homie and Holy worship. I looked at the low-slung altar, made of highly polished wood and shaped like a boat, an ark, a safe haven in turbulent times. It had been commissioned by Henry for this space. From behind it, Henry in white alb and emerald stole flung his arms right and left, embracing the gathering and calling, "The Lord be with you." My eyes ran to and fro at his ambidextrous invitation, and they were drawn to the candles. For the holders, each one bearing a lit taper, stood at attention on either end of the altar. And studying those small sentinels, I could no longer see where that break might be. The end. Trying to break more glass. I don't break glass anymore.
Thank you, Arthur.
My pleasure, Robin.
And we want to open this up to conversation. Any comment or question you might have, chats via the live stream, those that are joining us that way, we'll entertain some conversation.
Great.
Anyone, there's a mic here so that those online can also hear. If it needs to be brought to you, I can do that. I will monitor the live stream.
Okay. Questions, comments, feedback? Aidan, you have any rebuttals?
Several years ago, we were in a church in just out of Washington, D.C., and Mel Schmidt, I don't know if you know the man, was a pastor there in the Mennonite church. And he preached a sermon, and the title was, "My Wounded Father Wounded Me." Mm-hmm. And he talks in the sermon about his reaction to the abuse that he suffered for many years. Mm-hmm. And at one point, he said he had an opportunity to actually kill his father. Wow. And he had the stone in his hand, and he said he'd been a good ball player. He could have, at 30 paces, could have hit his father. Wow. He didn't do it, but the emotion and the possibility right. of that revenge mm-hmm. and that whatever justification for the mm-hmm. abuse. I don't know what my question is exactly, but what in your mind, what went through as you realized the abuse and the suffering? What were some of the emotional and the tensions within you that you went through? I plan to read the book, but
great.
I'd like to hear you.
Thank you. So, what's your name, sir? Rudy Friesen. So, Rudy, the answer to your question depends a little bit on what stage of life I am. So, as a child, my father beat me twice. I'll just say I was scared all the time because I saw his anger, but he beat me very badly on 2 occasions. The second time I was 14. I was around breakfast, actually. He came out of the basement around breakfast, beat me, and descended to the basement. Does that sound like an echo of something you've already heard tonight a little bit? And the second time, then I had to walk to school in junior high. That's where Cheryl and I went to school, and I was crying, and one of my friends, her name was Louise, she said, "Arthur, you look like you've been crying." And I said, "Oh, the sun was in my eyes when I was walking to school." I couldn't bear to tell her, partly out of shame, right? Out of exposing your parents, and also partly because This was not unusual when I was growing up. And I have a section in this book about other people's fathers who were far worse than my father. This was not the worst thing that I knew about. So I would say at that stage, I kind of took it for granted. And then for many years, I didn't really think about it, to tell you the truth. I didn't think that much about it. My second year at university, I had a nun was the professor, the first nun I ever got to know. And she gave us a journaling assignment to write about 10 stepping stones in our life. And I was 20. I had trouble thinking of 10 stepping stones. I wrote about, I'd lost my fountain pen a couple weeks earlier, and it really bothered me. So that was one of my stepping stones. Never occurred to me that what my father had done was especially significant. And then in my mid-30s, I did a lot of family of origin, family systems work. And that was very helpful to me at the time. I'm really grateful for it. It helped me a lot. And I started to think about these things, but I didn't even then get very far. But then as my life wore on, and I started telling my other parents or other people stories from my childhood, and I could see the shock on their faces, and I realized, oh, this is serious. That was really serious. And then as I learned about PTSD, and I learned PTSD is actually a form of brain damage, where a memory will get lodged in a particular part of your brain, and part of the problem with PTSD is you can't escape from that memory. And so flashbacks and triggers take you back to that memory. So you think you're in that dangerous situation again. And if you get triggered, you can't reason your way out of it. And so that's when I started to realize the seriousness and gravity of what my dad did. Now the thing is that the good news is we've been learning for the last 10 to 20 years about PTSD, for example. It's much more on the radar. I love the work of Gabor Mate, for example, in Vancouver. But the other thing we know, because of neuroplasticity, our brains can rewire themselves. So if you become aware of things and do work, you can change. And so that, in fact, is what I've been working on. And I do think that something has shifted for me in all this work. And I don't want to be too cocky about it because I just heard too many cocky stories in my life. But I will testify that I haven't had nightmares for quite a long time, neither about not being able to come back to Canada, nor about bullies either. And the other remarkable thing is I haven't had migraines for a very, very long time. And some of you know that I was plagued with migraines for years, decades actually, to the point where there was one 2-week period where I went to the emergency room 3 times over a 2-week period because the migraines were so bad. I call them suicide zone, that really you can't, life did not seem worth bearing. And I have not taken strong drugs to manage my migraines for quite a long time. And so I'm starting to suspect that the migraines had something to do with the PTSD that somehow got lodged in my body. So it's been a work of a long time, and I think this kind of work, in my case, you can't do it all the time, and you can't do it all at once. You do a little bit, you need a pause, you do a little bit, you need a pause, and this was the challenge for me as I moved into my 60s. Arlen, can I bother you or somebody for a little bit? I was very profligate with my water. Other comments or questions or inquiries? Tell me your name, please.
Hi, my name is Betsy Bergen.
Betsy.
And thank you for your story and for taking time to share it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
2 things. I really like the imagery of glass that you decide to use for your story.
Oh, thank you.
And
There's lots more in the books.
Okay.
Beach glass. I write about beach glass, which is
I see.
beautiful glass that comes from trauma. It's broken glass
Yes.
that's traumatized and makes beach glass. Or drift glass is one of the terms I like. Sorry, Betsy.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say I also really like the art form of mosaics. And again, those are from broken pieces.
Exactly.
And made beautifully into
Yeah.
artwork.
Yeah.
My other comment is just, is your mother still alive? And I know your book is about you and your father and your relationship, but
Yeah.
were you able to reconcile with her? Just thinking from the point of view of she wasn't able to stop what your father
Right.
did. Not that she should have been able to, but
Yeah.
is that part of the story for you? Or Is
Yeah,
she
so-
still living?
Yeah, my mother is still alive, and she was a great support to me as I was writing this book, answering lots of questions. But it's a very complicated thing to talk about living family members and their reaction to this book. And so what I will say, this is how I'll put it.
Okay.
Some of my family members were very supportive. Some of my family members answered a lot of questions. Some of my family members read parts or all of the book beforehand, and I did make changes accordingly. There were things that I took out at the request of other people. And some of my family members are very affirming of this project, and some of my family members are giving me intense blowback about this book. It's very, very hard. And my parents' generation didn't talk about these things, and that's true for others of us as well. It's very hard to talk about these realities, and to expose family secrets is quite a powerful thing.
Well, and it's an ongoing trauma, and
It is.
yet obviously healing is happening too. So,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Betsy. Other questions or comments?
My name is Arnold Neufeld-Fast.
Hi, Arnold.
And hi, Arthur. So Arthur and I were colleagues together for a time at Tyndale Seminary. And I grew up in the north end of St. Catharines as well. So these places that you describe are very familiar. We
Yeah.
had Dutch neighbors who brought us those
Droppies?
Dutch treats.
Okay. Gebakkies and droppies.
Yeah. And growing up in a community that had a lot of post-World War II immigrants.
Right. In your church too, at St.
My
Catharines and
church,
Armenia.
my friends on the street of different backgrounds. So this resonates a lot.
Yeah.
Often one says it's the father that helps shape a child's image of God.
Yeah.
And I wonder, if you reflect on this in your
I
book,
do.
and could
Yeah.
say a little bit more about
Yeah.
how your own journey theologically, or the way you've understood God, and how that has been shaped by your experience with your dad.
Boy, Arnold, you got that question exactly the way that I wrote it out for you.
There's a prompter right there.
Yeah. No, I'm actually lying, actually. But I'm glad for the question. Yeah, as I mentioned, I had a very vivid religious faith as a child. I experienced a call to ministry when I was 4 at Maranatha already, in a church that didn't really talk about call. And in a family, there were no clergy in my family. The only clergy person we knew about in my family was back in the 16th century in Groningen. So that's a while back. And I've actually thought a lot about this, and I'm going to talk about it on Sunday night at St. Margaret's, if anybody wants to go to there. Because you're exactly right. The image, and this is quite common, the image that a child has of God is often conflated with their parents, and then especially in those days with the image of one's father. And so in many ways growing up, I thought of God as my own father writ large, and I was scared. Now, I think fear of God is a good thing, but not the kind of fear I had as a child, where I was afraid that if I got one thing wrong, did one thing wrong, God might zap me or to send me to a concentration camp for all eternity. And in the Christian Reformed Church, the Dutch Calvinist tradition that I grew up in, it wasn't just getting one thing wrong, it was getting a doctrine wrong. You had to have all your doctrines precisely lined up. And so that was a very fearful thing. And it took me a while to grow out of that and beyond that. And one of the ways actually was I had a very powerful vision of God the Father and God the Son on Good Friday when I was 14, right around the last time my father beat me. And it was a vision of the Father and Son, and they were in my bedroom with me. They were peering down from the attic. The ceiling slid open. And in that I saw the love between the Father and the Son, which was, of course, a contrary to what I felt. I mean, I loved my father, but there was a great fear there. And I felt that it was a love that they were offering to me. They were inviting me into that community. I don't know if any of you know that famous Rublev Russian icon of the Trinity, the Old Testament Trinity, the three angels sitting around the table, and one side of the altar is open, and they're kind of gesturing to it because they're inviting you to join them at the table. And that was the invitation being extended to me. And so I think that vision was really helpful to me because it was a really key moment in helping me move beyond the deficient theology or vision or image that I had of God. And I'm really grateful for that. And then a number of other things happened along the line. And clearly one of the huge influences for me in that would be Henry Nouwen. And Henry Nouwen deeply formed and informed my ministry and contributed to the kind of pastor I am, which is one of the reasons he's one of the three people I dedicate this book to. Yeah. All right. Thanks. Other questions or comments or observations?
Hi, Arthur. My name is Aidan. This book, you said, took several years to write and went through various versions. So I'm very curious at when you get to meet an author talking about their work, about the process of the work. So I wonder what you learned in writing this book in particular, or how did it change from one version to another to what we have here?
Well, one of the ways it changed that, I already mentioned that I came to see that the primary story or conflict is the relationship of my father and me. That came into clearer focus. I think that the main thing, maybe the main two things I learned would be, first of all, go deeper, go deeper, go deeper. So you write it, and you write it again, and you try to figure out what's more here, what's missing, what was the feeling, what was going on for people, what could the motives be compassionate for yourself, but also the people that you're writing about. So go deeper, go deeper, go deeper. And the other big thing I learned was how important it is to pay attention to details, to tell the setting, to paint the picture, and to really take time with that. So to sit for a long time and remember and close my eyes and picture and think and revisit. That's one way to do it. I can tell you I don't know how many videos I watched of glass shattering because I was trying to wonder, I had these memories, but what does it really look like? And I played them over and over in slow motion. That helped me. And another thing I did actually for this book was I started keeping journals when I was 14 years old. I'd asked my teacher at Niagara District Secondary School, grade 9 or 10, I said, I want to be a teacher. What do I do? She said, keep journals. And she gave me suggestions of kind of things to read in the journals. And so I have this huge stack of journals, and for months, if not a couple of years, every day I read a few pages of those journals. I went all the way through all the journals twice. Not that they were all going to go in here, but this book is trying to help me understand my life and the trajectory of my life. And so I was trying to see what are some of the themes that wind themselves through my life. And in fact, that's where I got the Henry Nouwen story, because I wrote a lot of this book and I didn't remember. Can you imagine? I didn't remember the whole Henry Nouwen story. And then I read in my journal, I'm like, oh yeah. I remembered breaking the window, but I didn't remember what happened with Henry Nouwen. And I'm like, oh my goodness, how could I forget that? And then, and luckily I'd written that one up in great detail. And, and there were these two instances of broken glass. I mean, it was providential. What else could I call it? So those would be some comments that I offer. I learned that writing is more work than ever. It's harder than it used to be. And so even as I ponder my next book, I have a huge mess of a manuscript, which I won't explain much to you now, but some days I'm like, really? Do I want to go and do all that all over again? And Aidan, of course, I'm going to do all that over again. At least that's the plan. So, yeah. Other questions or comments?
Thank you, Arthur. One word I have not heard here is forgiveness. And you're talking about healing and making something from brokenness.
Yeah.
But I wonder how you reflect on the word forgiveness in connection to your experience.
Okay, thanks, Byron. So Byron says I haven't used the word reflection here, or I haven't used the word forgiveness here. The word forgiveness, first of all, let me assure you, does appear in the book. And for me, forgiveness does not mean it doesn't matter, it didn't happen, I'm going to forget about it. Forgiveness for me means a kind of letting go, a holding lightly and not holding this against the other person. And holding people up to God's light and wishing the best for them, which is what I feel towards my dad. I don't justify what he did. I don't think those things can be justified. But I also have done things myself that can't be justified. So, I don't want to condemn him harshly. I don't want to be self-righteous about that. But I really make a great effort at compassionately understanding my dad and holding him in God's light. And I really do believe that I'm going to see him by the Sea of Crystal. I'm quite confident about that. And I think we'll have a good discussion about this book together. I hope that addresses your question. Thanks, Byron. Anything else? Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
As I said, this conversation has been recorded. It will be available to view at commonword.ca. You're welcome to hang around tonight, purchase a copy. Arthur will be at the table to sign your copy. It's also available online for those at a distance. And have time to follow up with other comment or questions that you might have. Now, may glass shards become sea glass. And may cycles of trauma be broken, and may transformation and beauty emerge in all our lives. Thank you, Arthur. Good night, and I wish you good health and safety, and thanks for participating.